Legendaries in WoW have come quite a long way. At one time you worked extra hard, raided hours and hours, and with enough work and a little RNG, or maybe a lot of RNG, you were awarded a legendary weapon to wield against evil. Time passed and the concept of legendary weapons was replaced, first by legendary capes in Pandaria, then by rings in Draenor, before finally just kinda boiling down to random items to be equipped in Legion. In Legion, players can equip a huge array of legendaries that, while wielding some pretty epic names, aren't nearly as legendary as their old cousins from expansions past. Of course, even with the old legendary weapons fading into nothingness, most people still remember most of them pretty well, like Thunderfury. Don't say it. I figure now would be a good time as any to talk about and rank all of the legendary weapons from past expansions. I'll be ranking them on their usefulness, usability among classes, and how long they were usable for. Naturally, I won't be including artifact weapons or legendaries that aren't weapons, just the legendary weapons that existed before other legendaries would come to exist. Also, I'm not including raid or dungeon exclusive legendaries like Andonisis or the weapons from Kael'thas's encounter, as they were only usable in their respected dungeons. Even though facts, other people's experiences, and my own experiences are being used, this is still in the end of the day an opinion on each weapon and not to be taken as shots being fired at your favorite legendaries. Trust me, some of my favorites didn't do so hot either. Well, with that all out of the way, let's start this out with number 9, the worst of the bunch. God, does it pain me to start this list off with one of my all-time favorite legendaries, and that legendary is Thor'idal, the Star's Fury. Thor'idal is a legendary bow that drops in Sunwell Plateau off the final boss, Kil'jaeden. It had little to no lore except for a little bit of lore text on the actual weapon reading that the energy of the Sunwell courses through Thor'idal, implying that it is either created or blessed by the arcane energies of the Sunwell itself. Thor'idal's signature ability is that it actually generated its own ammo, very powerful ammo, allowing hunters, warriors, and rogues infinite shots with this very sexy weapon. So what's the deal with Thor'idal then? Why is it the worst legendary weapon? Well, for starters, it isn't guaranteed to drop. That's okay, right? I mean, not everything is guaranteed in WoW. Yeah, but it drops off the final boss of Sunwell, which just so happens to be the final raid of Burning Crusade, meaning that if you did manage to even get it to drop for you, you'd already cleared all the PvE content for the expansion, and one of the hardest raids in the history of the game. So, I guess you're using it for PvP. Doesn't help that Thor'idal was replaced pretty quickly into Wrath of the Lich King by Heroic and Nax gear. Worse is the fact that the Golden Bow of Quel'Thalas, a bow that drops earlier in the same raid, can almost meet Thor'idal in DPS. But the most painful thing ever for poor Thor'idal is that as of Cataclysm, ammunition for ranged weapons was removed, removing the signature flair that Thor'idal once brought to the table. All in all, Thor'idal isn't useless and it looks super cool, just wasn't all that amazing for the work needed just to hope it even drops. Up next is the legendary dagger pair, the Fangs of the Father. The daggers Golad and Tyriosh are crafted through a long quest line for the final raid of Cataclysm, Dragon Soul, and are powerful knives imbued with both the sinister essence of the old gods and the maddened fury of Deathwing himself. The Fangs' signature abilities are the slow fall they provide when used and a stacking damage buff. Yeah, too bad the amount of work to make these only really helped with a select few bosses in Cataclysm's raids. By the time you had these bad boys on one of your rogues, chances are you were already pretty far into Heroic, meaning at the most the biggest advantage these daggers would see would be against bosses like the painful Heroic Spine of Deathwing encounter, as well as PvP I guess. And of course they were replaced pretty early in the Mist of Pandaria, meaning they didn't last very long in the grand scheme of things. Better than Thor'idal, as at least it was useful against some heroic encounters, but still. At least the slow fall animation's pretty freaking awesome. I can already hear the BC fanboys and girls kicking my ass in the comments. The Warglaives of Azzinoth are up next. The Warglaives drop off Illidan Stormrage, the final boss of Burning Crusade's Black Temple. The blades once belonged to a demon properly named Azzinoth, who Illidan slayed for the weapons. The signature ability of the glaives are increased damage against demons and a haste buff proc. So right out the gate, I need to clear the air. These weapons aren't bad, far from it. In fact, they were a massive help in clearing the next raid in BC, Sunwell Plateau. The haste buff and increased damage against demons were amazing assets against all the bosses in Sunwell, and considering Sunwell is one of WoW's hardest raids, well, these are no-brainers. Too bad that's pretty much all they had going for them. After Sunwell, Wrath came out and these poor beauties became filled bank space. Another mega issue with them is that there are very low drop chances off Illidan, meaning you needed to farm Black Temple multiple times for even a chance at one, and you had to have both to get the benefits. As I said, not a bad legendary by any means, just sadly not very utilized, especially considering how iconic the person who owns them is. Coming up next is Shadowmourne, a powerful axe that is crafted within the halls of Wrath of the Lich King's final storyline raid, Icecrown Citadel. Shadowmourne is forged with the very frozen shards that once made up the frozen prison of the Lich King, created by the Demon Lord himself, Kil'jaeden. Shadowmourne's signature ability is a stat buildup very similar to the legendary daggers, but once they hit their buildup, instead of refreshing combo points, they let out a huge AoE explosion. This beastly axe was well received upon release, and rep allies, DKs, and warriors flocked to the very sight of it. While putting it together did take quite a bit of time, as a legendary should, it was still quite useful in battling most of the more challenging heroic Lich King encounters, as well as the pre-Cata raid Ruby Sanctum. It was usable in core content by 3 classes as mentioned before, meaning it had quite a bit of room to improve your core on more than one level. If that's not enough for you, then the 3 red sockets it housed at the time were easily enough to make anybody happy. Slap some strength gems in or armor pin and then bam! Solid weapon for solid DPS. Divine Storm, engaged. Dragonwrath is taking our next spot. This legendary staff is crafted deep within the Firelands and was once a part of Nordrassil, the World Tree, now enchanted and empowered by the mystical blue dragonflight. Dragonwrath's signature ability is a chance on hit to duplicate any spell previously used, and yes, it works well with dots as well. It also had the ability to change the user into a dragon for flying purposes, and while this isn't very useful in raiding, it was still a very nice novelty ability. Dragonwrath was usable by all spellcasting DPS, which at that time totaled 5 different classes and 9 different specs. Whew, that's a lot of people fighting for this wonderful staff. Dragonwrath saw use in Heroic Firelands as well as the entire Dragon Soul raid tier, and was best in slot throughout both. Guilds looking to go back and fight the hard mode only Sinestra encounter would also see a big benefit from the staff, as Sinestra was still quite challenging during Firelands, and dropped some best in slot gear, namely that damn trinket. Dragonwrath served its purpose quite well and is still one of WoW's better legendaries to this date. By the fire be purged if it isn't Sulfuras, the Hand of Ragnaros. Sulfuras was the very first legendary of World of Warcraft, being pieced together by players during the original WoW raid Molten Core. It is the ancient powerful hammer wielded by the elemental lord of fire Ragnaros. Sulfuras' signature ability is a chance on hit to shoot a fireball, and its thorns-like effect that damages anyone that harms the player wielding it. So Sulfuras is an interesting one, as it was going to be my top 3 originally before I ended up bumping it up to here. I'll get to that in a moment. Sulfuras was usable by multiple classes, namely warriors and shamans, though paladins could also use it. I was quite familiar with enhancement shamans using it, but I played horde, so that's probably why. Its raw damage is insanely high, and it was only matched by a few specific weapons throughout vanilla, meaning you could use this weapon through all of vanilla's original content, from Molten Core all the way to Nax 40. The only reason I lowered its ranking on this list is because it wasn't necessarily best in slot throughout vanilla, as weapons like the Dark Edge of Insanity and Might of Menethil could easily technically replace it. But nonetheless, it is still a powerhouse and deserving of the title of WoW's first real legendary. The top three are here, and at number 3 is Atiesh. Atiesh was forged by players during Nax 40 and Temple of Ahn'Qiraj, requiring several pieces from the respected raids, including splinters off the Nax bosses, in order to put it together, and was the ancient staff used by the Guardian of Treesful, Medivh. Atiesh's signature ability is pretty unique actually. Atiesh provides a party-wide buff depending on the class using it, such as crit buffs from mages or healing buffs from priests. This gave a fresh air of uniqueness when raiding even content that was after Nax. As the weapon may not have had the same damage or healing output as other future weapons, it assisted the raid on a level that no other staff or one hand really ever could. Atiesh could also create portals to Karazhan, which was the next raid to release after Nax in the beginning of Burning Crusade, so that was also kinda handy. Atiesh was usable by 4 different classes: Druid, Mage, Priest, and Warlock, which was a massive assistance to your entire raid core. Atiesh was best in slot in Nax 40, but also saw use in tier 4 as its buffs were quite assistive against the respective raids of that tier. Because of its huge variety, interesting effects, and rather nice length of being used, I figured 3 was a good spot for this beast of a staff. Too bad not too many were actually crafted, meaning it's legendary in its own right just by being so damn rare to see nowadays. Truly a testament to the difficulties of the older WoW content, as it has since been removed from the game. At number 2 is Val'anyr. Forged deep within the Titan city of Ulduar, this weapon once belonged to the first Earthen King, who used it to create life for his people. Val'anyr's signature ability is a chance on heal to proc a buff, allowing all heals to put a bubble on those affected by the heal. Val'anyr is by far my favorite legendary, and for good reason. I was a holy paladin when it came out, so I had a huge fondness for it. Val'anyr was best in slot for all support classes, but was also best in slot for Shadow Priests during Ulduar, and remained best in slot for all support classes throughout the rest of Wrath of the Lich King. Its extremely useful damage reduction bubbles on proc were amazing, and in some cases, a must for aggressive elitist raiding during most of Wrath. It found great use in hard mode Ulduar, TOC, TOGC, ICC, Heroic ICC, and of course Ruby Sanctum. It also saw some use in early Kata, though it was replaced pretty early by Dungeon Gear, as its stats really couldn't match up to the raid gear. With its huge variety and massive length of use, it was a no-brainer that this would get high on the list. But wait, then what's number 1? Number 1 and the greatest legendary weapon in WoW history is... Yeah, someone's gonna say it. Thunderfury, Blessed Blade of the Windseeker. This weapon was forged in between Molten Core and Blackwing Lair, and is WoW's second legendary. A powerful artifact wielded by the Prince of Wind, Thunderran. You release him from his prison, and then strike him down, taking the sword afterwards for your own personal use. Thunderfury's signature skill is its ability to, on hit, proc a lightning strike that chains to foes, dealing damage, reducing their nature resistance, dropping their attack speed, and generating a large amount of threat. So Thunderfury is an interesting case for why it's the best legendary ever. First of all, it was only really used by 2 classes, rogues and warriors, with warriors only being the ones I ever really saw using it in PvE raid content. Funny thing is though, it wasn't actually used by Fury Warriors, it was used by tanks for its huge proc AoE that generated massive threat on all targets it hit. This made the aggressive and hectic tanking of Vanilla and Burning Crusade far easier for warriors who were best in slot tanks at the time. But wait a second, I bet you're thinking, did you just say Burning Crusade? Yep, Thunderfury was best in slot through all of Vanilla and a huge chunk of Burning Crusade. You see, Blizzard fixed Thunderfury to where it wouldn't interrupt CC effects, which were a big thing for most pulling in Burning Crusade, especially dealing with hectic trash like in Magtheridon's Lair. Warrior tanks were using it through tier 4 and 5, and hell, there are even reports of players seeing use out of it in Black Temple, meaning it lasted from tier 1 and 2 all the way to tier 6. That is insane. Yeah, sure, only one class really saw benefit out of it, but that's the longest length of weapon use in the history of the game. To see that much content is a true reason for why this is the de facto legendary of World of Warcraft. Well, I've done it. I've ranked all the legendary weapons in WoW history. Well, at least the ones that count. Don't agree with my list? Tell me how you would have ranked these legends in the comments below. I'm always up for a debate. Or, you know, some love. Why does no one love me? Hey, if you enjoyed the content, definitely subscribe. I'm Captain Potato, and I'll see you guys next time, next video.